Episode 126, Apostate with Sarah Bacaller. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, I'll be interviewing Sarah Bacaller. This is an exciting episode for me because it is the first official, ladies and gentlemen, the first official episode celebrating the launch of the book Apostate. Sarah has organised 21 different people who each recount some of their recovery from Christianity. There'll be more episodes that discuss the book, including interviews with contributors. To buy the book, see link 1 in the show notes. Sarah's book, Fault Lines, that she mentions is link 2. And link 3 is to a YouTube video where Sarah and one of the contributors have already done a video promoting the book. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. This is Matthew. I have mentioned it a couple of times in the past. So this is the formal, the official, the absolutely, it is definitely happening episode where we talk about the book which I've contributed chapter to. So the book is called Apostate. I have contributed a chapter to it. There's about 20 other people who have also contributed chapters to it. I have read through the book. I haven't quite read all of the chapters yet, but I've certainly read a chunk of them. I love the book. I hope that you, dear listener, will love it too. There will be details on how to buy it. This will not be the only episode in which I plug the book. I can promise you that. But before we get to all of that stuff, I do want to talk to the person who has been responsible for driving this book, who came up with the idea, who invited people to come onto it, set up the Facebook group to bring us all together, did all the preliminary editing of all of our early chapters, did the tedious job of reading through all our dirty drafts, cleaning them all up, making them neat, getting a publisher involved, having goodness knows how many conversations with that. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on. Congratulations on doing that. You probably can't breathe after all the work that you've been doing for the last 6 months. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks so much, Matthew. It is a pleasure to be here talking to you today and to be talking about the book.
Yes, absolutely. Now, to clear up for the listeners, most of the times when I talk to somebody, they have an obviously English accent or an obviously American accent. You have neither. So tell us where you are and why.
Oh, I'd like the listeners to guess. I'll give them a moment
It's
to
New
guess.
Zealand, isn't it? It's New Zealand.
How dare you? How dare you? No. I'm from Australia and I live about an hour out of Melbourne. Sort of on the urban rural fringe in a very beautiful spot, close to lots of beautiful beaches and that is where I'm from. That's my accent. I've grown up in Australia. I do have a very multicultural background, but I think my accent's pretty Aussie. not as Aussie as it could be, mate, but yeah.
Now, those of us who might be geographically challenged, whereabouts is Melbourne? That's South Coast, is it? Do I remember right?
Yeah, so Melbourne is right down the southeast bottom of Melbourne, so of Australia, sorry. If you've got a map of Australia and the highest tip on the eastern side, you just go straight down from that right down to the bottom of the mainland, you'll pretty much hit Melbourne. And so Melbourne is on the sea. It's on the northern point of Port Phillip Bay, and I live on the eastern side of Port Phillip Bay, kind of further down towards the coast. So so that's where it is. I can't give you the exact latitude and longitude, I'm sorry, but
but you a surfer? Are you a skier? Is boat ownership mandatory where you are?
Oh, I'm a gardener, Matthew, actually. My husband has done a bit of surfing. I've also done a little bit of surfing, but it takes a lot of energy. But we love the beach. We're often at the beach. Our kids are have always been water babies.
Nice.
And in Australia, that it's kind of standard practice that as soon as you're allowed to. So when kids are about 6 months old, they start swimming lessons, basically.
Brilliant.
That's what we do. And one of my jobs, as I mentioned, I work as a gardener. So there's a spot called the Mornington Peninsula, which is down on the southeastern side of Port Phillip Bay, and go around there working on lots of different gardens there. So I get to enjoy the sea view from lots of different angles.
Lovely, very nice. But I do need to go back to Australia. I visited Australia once, and it
Okay.
was in the year 2000. So I was there for Christmas 2000, New Year 2001. But I was over the other side. I was visiting some friends of my wife's over in Perth and Fremantle.
Oh, cool.
So
Yeah.
we were at that end. We were Eastern Australia. So we went all the way up to Shark Bay and all the way down to Margaret River, and enjoyed that part. Saw lots of glorious sunsets. Came very close to a snake in the sea. The guide there didn't seem to be bothered about it, but I thought, hang on a minute, aren't snakes supposed to be poisonous? But the guide wasn't particularly bothered by it, so we stayed standing ankle deep in water with this snake swimming between our feet. It was like, okay.
Interesting. Well, okay, that's interesting. I mean, it's not uncommon for us to have snakes around where we I mean, you know, you don't walk down the street and see a snake, but if you go walking in a bushland reserve in summer, then there's probably, you know, a 20% chance you'll see a snake, but that's fine. We're just pretty used to that, I think.
Yes, I'm sure. Just don't do anything to frighten the poor bugger.
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. That and spiders. Oh, and the other thing I was warned about, all the locals couldn't help but warn me about drop bears. Apparently, drop bears are a really dangerous thing in Australia as well.
Yeah, well, they were having a lot of fun with you there, Matthew, weren't they? We have some koalas around where I live. It's not often that you see them because they like to hide, but they are around, which is very nice. But no, they don't drop on you. It's not part of their repertoire. They do a
surprise kamikaze attack on you.
No.
Okay, right. Okay, well,
but the magpies might. The magpies might. Sorry to interrupt, but you know they actually do. In springtime, they'll swoop you, and they can be pretty brutal, actually. So. Yeah,
and a bird beak making contact with your head, especially with the follically challenged roof that I've got. Yeah, I wouldn't want a bird. No, I wouldn't want a bird beak making contact with my skin at any kind of velocity. No, I can imagine.
Don't come in springtime.
I can imagine that can be deep. So one more question about Australia. What are the winters like there? Does it get cold there as it does here in Blighty, or do you still have a pleasant winter?
I reckon like our average daily temperatures during winter might be between, I don't know, 10 to 16 degrees Celsius. So where I live, it doesn't.
Still pretty mild then.
Yeah, pretty mild. Yeah, where I am, it doesn't snow. Probably you have to drive into some mountainous terrain, which isn't too far away, a couple of hours away by car. So there are people who enjoy their skiing and snowboarding. That's not kind of part of our family culture so much, but the kids do enjoy it when we've been up to the snow. But yeah, it's pretty mild, which is good. We get a few light frosts where I live, but that's about it.
Okay, brilliant. Right, so business, because now that we've made all of the listeners want to immediately hop on a flight over to Australia to cuddle koalas, bat off drop bears, and have fun with water and snow on the same day. So Apostate, the book. So you've gathered together, if I remember right, it's about 21 contributors, some of whom are podcasters, some of whom are quite active in the deconstructed faith community, and some are people who've travelled it on their own and have hung around, and some still carry hurt, and some have gone through that hurt and are very happy to tell their story in all its guts and glory. So what was it that made you want to put this book together, I guess, is the very first question I want to ask.
Yeah, good question. I mentioned this in the introduction to the book. I've written a brief introduction, but I was kind of working through a lot of my own stuff. And one of the things that I did as a part of that was to write a book, or a novella. Basically, it's a fictional novella, but it explores a lot of the questions that I was wrestling with about life and faith and anxiety and the afterlife and asking questions and the spaces in which we do that. And I wrote this story, and I was able to find a publisher who wanted to publish it, and it was Whitford in the US, which I thought was actually great of them because they are a faith affiliated publisher, and I felt like I was pushing the boundaries a bit with this story. But I emailed one of our kind of major Christian bookstores in Australia and asked if they'd be willing to stock it. and I kind of gave them a bit of a précis about what the book was about, and sent them some information, and they must have, whoever was responsible must have kind of had a look through it or read it, and just kind of sent me a very blunt email saying, like, no way, why would we do that, kind of thing.
Wow.
In not so many words, well, not in those words, but that was kind of the message, which was not really very nice to receive, because I felt that the story, I don't know, like, I felt like I was fairly gentle. I wasn't kind of saying the church is bad, screw the church, like, let's all, whatever. But I was kind of highlighting how important it was to ask these big questions and to reflect on, I guess, the experience that faith narratives have on our day-to-day existence, and our feelings about ourselves and our lives. And so I kind of was looking for a bit of solidarity after that. And then I started thinking, like, oh, actually, probably people in the sort of deconstructed community are the ones who are going to connect with this story more than anyone, because it sort of traces the emergence of these questions that become so big that that they kind of change direction, that change someone's life direction. So that story is called The Fault Lines Founding Liberty. And so I stumbled across the Graceful Atheist Facebook group, joined it, and kind of posted about this experience that I'd had, and was just like, woe is me, this was not very nice, and which was, and had some really kind of compassionate responses from people. And I was like, oh, I'm just, they don't know who I am. I've just jumped in here to complain to them all, and yet, I'm receiving these kind of thoughtful, compassionate replies. And so then I was obviously following the group and began, seeing the posts that people were putting up, and the snippets of their stories. And it was so humbling, I suppose, and I don't know, gut-wrenching, to be faced, or just to encounter these very immediate, heartfelt pleas for understanding and compassion, and just a group where people could say, what the hell do I do now that I'm in this situation, or I'm really scared, or I don't know what's happening, or lots of questions about personal relationships and spouses, and what to do when your beliefs start to change, and that starts impacting relationships. And I was like, man, people in this group have such important stories to tell, and I want to hear more of these stories. And I think it's really important for other people to hear these stories, especially people in the church. You know what ideas are like. Sometimes they just strike like lightning. It's the inspiration. So I actually was on a trip with my family. We were in a camper van, and I was sort of lying in my camper van bed with my nose about, I don't know how many inches from the camper van roof, and hearing the sound of the waves crashing not too far away outside, and the idea struck, and I thought, let's write a book where we gather some stories of people who are willing and able to tell them, and I'd love to read it, and so I hope other people would too. And also I'd love to give people the opportunity to tell their stories in a focused way, that really honors those stories. So that's how it happened.
And thank you so much for doing that, Sarah. And quick shout out to everybody on the Deconstruction Anonymous Facebook group and the associated Graceful Atheist podcast, because that podcast has done a great service to the community. And I want to echo what you said about that community in that Facebook group, because they are loving people. They care for each other. And I know I've put out my own posts on there, and I've seen many posts like the ones that you've talked about. And the love and the community that flows out of that group is much needed and is deeply, deeply appreciated. And it's quite sad that people end up in that group needing love and not getting it from the people that they most expect it from. And then they suddenly get it from strangers, people who don't know anything about them. And there's something that's both heartwarming but also quite saddening about that. So I'm glad that group exists, and I want to support that group as much as possible. And I like what you said just now about people telling their story in a structured way, because I've done my own episode on the Graceful Atheist podcast a couple of years ago. And when you're telling your story in an interview format like that, you're thinking on the fly, and that you don't know which way it's going to go. And you can prepare what you want to say as much as possible, but it never goes the way you expect it. And the great advantage of writing is that you can structure it how you want, you can edit it as many times as you want. And before the world sees it, it's been read multiple times, it's gone through multiple times, you can sleep on it, you can sleep on it again, and you can go back through it. And it's a much more cultivated process. And I like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And look, everyone, I want to kind of shout out to the contributors, because everyone, I mean, I can't remember exactly how long ago it was that I had the idea, but we have worked solidly on this for at least the last year, you know, and contributors, obviously everyone has sort of different levels of experience in terms of writing. You know, some of our contributors are experienced writers, others have not really done much writing in that sort of way in the past, and everyone's really stuck at it and responded so graciously to my kind of editorial attempted guidance, and I just really appreciate that people have been willing to stick with the process, because it is a long process, the process of publication, and you know, I think in the last couple of weeks, in the last 6 weeks, I've probably gone through 3 or 4 different versions of the proof, you know, and people and have been pestering people, you know, with can you look through your chapter and blah blah blah, and they've had to do that lots of times, so I really appreciate that, and a lot of work has gone into it.
I don't doubt it for a second, and yes, I've been the recipient of several emails from you on my own contribution. I loved being involved in that contribution. As soon as I saw the post that said, I've got this idea, I was yes. And it was really good to see the numbers jump up quite quickly. So I'm glad we've got over 20 people involved. So cheeky question then, you must have read everybody's story a handful of times. Does it ever get, I'm going to use the word, probably not the right word, but I'm going to use it anyway. Does it ever get tedious reading those stories?
Well, before I answer that, I'm going to clarify my last point. When I said a lot of work goes into it, I was talking about the work of the contributors, not me. I signed up, and obviously I'd done a lot of work, but when I signed up, I knew it was going to be a lot of work. And I feel like for the contributors, they didn't necessarily know how much work it was going to be. So they have put in a lot of work that they didn't necessarily know they were signing up for. Is the point that I was trying to emphasize. But how many times have I read? Oh, does it ever become tedious? No. Well, I've just started actually recording the audiobook, which I'm narrating, because that's another thing that I do is narrating audiobooks. So I probably more than a handful of times I've read each person's story. I would say at least 10 times for each story, like a really careful read, and maybe more. And I wondered when I was coming to do the audiobook, like I've gone through these stories lots of times, is it going to be tedious or difficult to kind of maintain my focus as I'm reading them aloud? But it's not difficult. It's because giving voice to those stories aloud is a different way of engaging with the stories, and I think because I know the stories fairly well now, there's a flow to it, and I feel like I'm able to give voice to them in an authentic way, I hope. I mean, look, and the other thing is, when you're editing, there are many different layers or many different lenses through which you read a chapter. So, you know, when I'm doing like a fine-tooth comb kind of edit of a chapter, it's different from when I'm reading a chapter to kind of get a sense of the narrative as a whole, or the pacing and that sort of thing. So anything that's worth having is some trouble, is a quote that I like from Anne of Green Gables, and so I think I knew there's going to be hard work as part of it, and that's fine. It's all just part of the process.
I'd like to get personal for a bit, because
sure,
I'm one of the contributors to the book, and I've told my story, variations of my story, multiple times through this podcast medium, both on the Graceful Atheist, a couple of other podcasts. I'm currently working through a series for my own podcast where Andrew, David and myself are telling our story in a long format. We've done 2 episodes. I'm trying to get my head together around recording episode 3. I probably won't get to record that until the new year now. But what I'm trying to say is I'm used to telling my story. But even then, the actual sitting down and writing my story, because although I've written it down a couple of times for my own purpose in order to verbally tell it, but I've never written it down in order for somebody else to read. And that little nuance in itself was a big step for me. And even then, writing down things that I knew, and I've got a part of my story has got quite a traumatic kidnap scenario.
Yeah.
And I know that story extremely well. I've told that story extremely well. But actually typing it out was a very different experience for me. And that story still felt raw to me. It brought a new freshness, isn't the right word, but it did feel like the wounds that I thought were healed were being jabbed again, because I was putting it out in a different context. I'm mostly safe talking about it verbally on another podcast, but that writing experience, so I can imagine that other people, again, those tough parts of their life was probably a similar experience for them. So I think we need to give credit to the emotional cost to our contributors as well. But then the weirdest thing was when I got the first edits back from you and I read it through, I went, that's not how I would say that. And there was this psychological letting go of, those are my words. I've written my story down. Now it's going through a process. And that letting go of the story and letting somebody else clean up my words and edit my story for an audience, somebody who has a better idea of that process than myself, was more emotional than I expected it to be.
Really? Okay.
And it wasn't until I was actually able to say to myself, let go of the story, Matt.
Yeah.
Move on. Let somebody else polish it. It's now ready for other people to read. Yeah. It doesn't have to be your perfect words. It still pushes out the same meaning. Nothing has actually changed. And actually that emotional letting go was actually very liberating.
Wow.
So
okay.
I want to say thank you to that, because that was an experience I was unused to. And then, of course, it went on and had a bigger edit and then came back. And there were a couple of words in there where I went, oh, I wouldn't say that.
Yeah.
And I just had to sit for a minute and then go back and reread it and go, actually, you know what? I'm happy with that. I don't need to change that. I don't need to get upset over that. Yes, it's not how I would have phrased it, but it's okay. And I had to remind myself that the people reading it will still get something from it. And reading it in that final draft that you've sent out, and I read back through my story again, it still made me cry. I was still very happy with the story. And I went, okay, that's good. I'm okay with that. It's not 100% me, but that's good. And I'm good with that.
Yeah.
So thank you for that new experience, Sarah.
Well, I'm really grateful that you've shared that, Matthew. And I think, that's right, because writing for an audience and writing for a book, it's, as you mentioned, just writing your story out on paper where it's there staring back at you is an experience in and of itself.
Yeah.
But then to give it over to someone else with their red pen. And I was very, very conscious about this because these stories are so deeply personal that, I mean, I know what it's like to have your heartfelt words corrected. I remember when I started, I was at university and I had begun work on what was more or less an honours thesis. and starting that process with a supervisor who goes through and edits the work. And I just found that so hard because I was so invested in every word and in the way that I'd said things, and it was so hard for me not to take it. I took it really personally at first, but I kind of realized that if I'm going to progress with this, if I'm going to move forward, I actually just have to get used to this process. But it's easy to forget now. That's probably about, I don't know, 10 plus years ago now for me. And I've done a fair bit of writing since then. And, you know, for example, in an academic context, when I've written articles, you always have peer review, you always have people pulling it apart. And it's sort of important, I guess, for me to remember what it's like to be new to that process and how gut-wrenching it can be. And so, you know, I was talking about everyone's hard work, but it's also the hard work of putting up with me, coming to the stories and saying, can we phrase this differently? Can we cut this out? Can we rearrange this? You know, and I hope that in that process that people have felt that my goal has been to, I don't know, to put their story on a platform as effectively as possible so that it engages readers as well as possible, without wanting to take away at all from the way that they tell that story or impose I did not want to impose my own voice on that story, on those stories at all. And it's a very fine line. And there were some edits, you know, when the contributors would say to me, I wouldn't say it like that. Can we leave it how it was, you know? Or that's not a word I would use. Can we use something else instead? And often it would be a process, you know, I mean, what I would call like a dialectical process where it's like back and forth, and then you actually come to a solution that's not what either of you suggested in the first place, but is kind of better that you come to together through that process of working it out, which is an amazingly valuable process when it comes to writing. So yes, people have had to put up with me coming to their stories and, you know, probably sometimes stepping over the line of imposing my voice too much. But I hope that in the end, the product that we have is the best that it can be. And, you know, and just because a person's written their story in this way for the book doesn't mean that stops them from writing it again in their own way in a different context or you know, that sort of thing. So, yeah.
And yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And in my reading of the book, the individual voice still comes through on each story. So I don't think you've lost anything. And I'll be perfectly honest, I expected more edit on mine.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to assume that you went kind on mine.
Oh, no, I think I was fairly even across the board, so I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, there were stories I just really didn't need to do much as well, so yeah.
So we obviously want to give people a little bit of a taste of the book, but we also want to buy them. Check the show notes, dear listeners. Check the show notes. There will be details about where to get the book. The book is due out on the 6th of January. Have I got that right?
Yeah,
This episode will be around about that date. So check your calendar as you're listening to this. Check the show notes. There will be show notes in the next episode as well. I will be plugging this book. I promise you I will be plugging this book. So stay tuned. I'll also try and find the link to the book that Sarah wrote that she's mentioned as well. Sarah will send me a link about it afterwards. So if you want to go and get that, we will also be able to arrange that as well. The book will be called Apostate, so put that into your search engine of choice. I'm sure there'll be several options that come up with that, but look out for the one that we will be linking in the show notes. So Sarah, when you put all these stories together, there must have been a little bit of nervousness about what kind of things were going to come up. Was there, you obviously no, we won't need to give any personal details or anything like that, but were there any surprises, things that surprised you about what came up, or things that really pleased you? What are there any examples of things that gave you the biggest emotion when you came up, or things that you didn't even expect?
Interesting question. Look, I I don't think I was as nervous about what would come up in the stories as I was about finding a publisher who wanted to publish them, because I kind of launched this project and went, okay, we've got people signing up. Like, can we do justice to this by actually finding a publisher who wants to publish it? So I just want to shout out to John at Apocryphal Press. And it was actually through another member of the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook page that I came across his publishing company, because another person had written the book, and he'd published it, and he responded to my email about our book like it was like within 24 or 48 hours. It's like, when does that ever happen with a publisher?
Wow.
Very
cool.
He was
well done,
really
Sarah.
keen. Oh, well, look, John's been amazing. It was just a matter of finding the right fit. But in terms of the stories, they are actually richer and deeper and more expansive, both in the themes, in the themes that they cover and in the breadth of people's experience than I was expecting. And yet at the same time, there are these kind of common threads that are woven through all of them. Mm-hmm. Things like being willing to ask the hard questions and think critically and, hold your beliefs up to scrutiny, and, this idea of coming home to yourself, that's actually quite a strong theme that's emerged. And we've got it's mostly contributors from the US, but you're one of the I think one of two contributors from the UK. We've got a number of contributors who, like yourself, grew up with parents who are missionaries, which I found really interesting, and I was really pleased with. So through that, the missionary experience, the sort of reflection on sort of the colonialist impetus that is often kind of woven into, Western Christianity. But I think, something that I think is so great about the book is the breadth and the depth of deep theological reflection. And I just feel like so many of the things that I've thought about in terms of, or wrestled with myself in terms of theology and faith, were addressed so comprehensively in these stories when we brought them together, like a multifaceted diamond where, you're piecing it together facet by facet. I know you don't piece diamonds together, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
And I just feel like this book says everything that I hoped it would say and more. I'd
like to pick up on that, because one thing that this book does scream to my mind in going through it is the contributors are intelligent people. They are thoughtful people. They are articulate people, and that comes across through all their stories. And one of the lies that's often told about people who deconvert is that, they had a painful experience, they just gave up. That is not true in any of the stories that are featured. No. And anybody who reads any of those stories and then still says that hasn't been paying attention. Yeah. Because these are people who thought, yes, there is pain in some of the stories, in many of the stories. Yes, there are people who have been hurt, but these aren't people who just got hurt and gave up. These are people who wrestled. These are people who thought deeply. These are people who tried to save a crumbling faith through intellectual prowess. Yeah. And then through that found a way out. There isn't anybody who just rolled over and gave up because they didn't like what they'd experienced.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And, and there are a couple of stories where people say, I actually haven't been majorly hurt by the church. It's not because I've been hurt that I've left. There's a couple like that where they say there hasn't been kind of a traumatic experience. A lot of times there has for people. But a lot of times that what has actually, those traumatic experiences that have sort of erupted have been the result of things that were already there underlying, in their experience the whole time, and have brought things to a head. So it's, none, as you say, none of these stories are sort of like, oh, something bad's happened, screw that, I'm going to get out of here and then, bag it all out. And that's actually that one of the other things that I love about this book is that at no point does any contributor have a go at the church or Christian people or the Christian faith out of a sense of, out of a sense of bitterness or just wanting to have a go at it, like criticize it for the sake of it. There's none of that. There's no cheap shots. There are just none. People's experiences range from, there's something, there's one contributor for whom, he says there's something about Jesus that resonates with him still, but he does not see those positive elements in the church, and he can't reconcile being part of the church, which he actually sees as undermining a lot of what he feels Jesus was on about. I mean, that's his experience. That's quite different to some of the other stories. But, but there are a lot of people for whom there are people that they love in their family, their spouse, who are still part of the church. And people say, some contributors say things like, I feel so angry. I feel so upset. I feel so regretful about all the time that I poured into this, into this kind of life. But I temper that anger because people I love are still part of it, or because I can still see the value in faith for some people, or, these are very, very mature, well-balanced, intelligent reflections.
Yes.
Where, as I say, there are no cheap shots. There's no, bagging out of religion for the sake of it. There's none of that. It's people being honest about their personal experience because they can do nothing else. They can only be where they are because that's what their experiences have led them to. And they kind of share these stories as a gift to us to take on board and add to our own collection of evidence as we evaluate where each of us kind of stands in relation to these questions.
Thank you for that, Sarah. And I've just remembered the other thing that I wanted to say when I was talking about my experience was, I'm looking forward to hearing a different voice read my story.
Okay.
It's going to be interesting for me. I haven't yet got my head around what it would be like hearing a female voice read my story for obvious reasons. But I'm looking forward to that. But I want to absolutely echo what you've just said about the contributors. And the question I want to ask you off the back of that is, was there a point when when those first drafts started coming in where you said to yourself, yes, I have something here that is going to be published?
I actually don't remember, Matthew, to be perfectly honest. But I do remember that just this feeling of growing, what was it? What word could I use? Almost like awe, that like these stories are coming in and these people are sharing these stories, and they're such amazing stories, like, which are reflective of the people who have written them. And I couldn't believe that that it cohered so well, because an idea is just an idea. Like it sounds great in your head, but when you put legs on it, sometimes an idea doesn't kind of take off in the way you hope. But this was just one of those occasions where it did.
Excellent. And I'm really looking forward to doing it. And just for clarity, this is going to be a printed book as well as an audio book as well as an ebook.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's right. So the audiobook, I should mention that it will be available a little bit later than the print book. That's just down to me and my ability to make my schedule happen. So bit of background is that I've just in the last few months also been finishing off a PhD in philosophy. So this has been kind of one of many projects that has been happening, and the narration, I'm about, well, I guess by the time this episode airs, the audiobook will be well and truly winging its way to audiobook platforms. But the pre-order for the audiobook should be available pretty much by the time, by the 6th of January. So
stay listening to Still Unbelievable. As soon as I have update on that, it'll be there. Trust me, people, I am not going to stop talking about this book, all right? Just deal with it. So you did a PhD while organising this book. That's presumably while also holding down a job as well?
Yeah, and probably kids are also the main kind of the kids are the main job. No, yeah, so PhD, I don't know, a couple of different I don't know. I'm just one of those people who likes to have variety and do lots of things. So yes, I've been doing a PhD. The past year I've been working in a kind of university research job, but before that, I don't know, I was doing bits and pieces, gardening work, as I mentioned. I also, so the audiobook stuff, I co-direct an audiobook production company. So there are varying levels of busyness with that. But
what is it with some
interesting.
people and addicted to being busy? I mean, my wife does a fantastic full-time job for a charity in the local area, and a couple of years ago she said, I'm going to do a PhD or do a degree. That was it. She did a degree.
Yeah.
And then she did the degree, and they said, you know what? I want to do another one. So she's now just asked. And I'm like, for goodness sake, what between the work that you do, the awesome work that you do, us watching fantastic crime dramas and you cooking fantastic meals, how do you have time to do that as well?
Wow, yeah,
but apparently she does.
Well, I don't like the idea of being busy, and I don't feel busy. I mean, I do a lot of my work. My research job was all from my house, everything revolves around school pickup and drop off, and and the fact that I need early nights, and all this kind of thing. I just I don't know. I have been wrestling with this question, Matthew, now that the PhD is done, and I'm not I don't think I'm one of those people who can go halfway around the world chasing my dream career, like my academic job. There's very few philosophy jobs in Australia, and Australia is huge. Like, if I go to Perth, it's equivalent to going to the other side of Europe, basically.
Yes. The distances are big. Yes.
Yeah, and look, and my kids, it's been a big few years, with COVID, and we had 2 years of remote schooling in Australia, basically, and just having my kids happy and settled in their schools with their friends and all that is really important. So I'm just asking myself what it looks like to be content with where I am and what I actually want in life. So I don't know the answer to that yet.
Well, good luck in the next PhD or whatever it is that you decide to do. Okay.
The next book.
Yeah, the next book, absolutely. So fiction or non-fiction, I guess.
Well, I think I'm gonna try and turn my PhD into a book. And interestingly, honestly, like, my PhD is me wrestling with all my baggage of having grown up in a Christian home, actually. It's philosophy of religion, it's all of that. So I think I'm going to enjoy, I mean, basically, you've probably, listeners will be able to hear a theme here. I write a novella, then I'm editing this book, and I've got this PhD, which is, I'm basically hitting my baggage from all angles here. Possibly while still avoiding telling the story in the way that the book contributors have themselves done. Okay. So, yeah. Right.
Well, I would like to ask you a few more personal questions, but just before I get to that, in reading through these stories, were there any stories that resonated with you personally and your own experiences?
Good question. I'm going to open up the book so that I can look at the contents list.
Yeah, there are some very cool chapter titles. I must confess. I think my favourite one is the Ship of Thesis chapter title. So Seth, well done. Good chapter title. I love it. Here in the UK, we call it Trigger's Broom, but it means exactly the same thing. And British people will get it. If you're not British, you won't get it. That's perfectly fine. You're not dim. It's just peculiarly British. But yes, I did love that chapter title. So, Sarah.
Well, Seth will be delighted to hear that, because that was a last minute change. Because
was it really?
Yeah, because Seth's title actually drew on some song lyrics, and when I emailed the the band contact to find out about whether the process of getting rights to use song lyrics, they said it's very long and complicated and expensive, and obviously we don't have the capacity for that. So I think Seth kind of pulled that out, that title. So he'll be delighted to hear that it's your favorite, I think.
Excellent. Good for him.
Yeah. it's a really good question about which ones I identified with most. I think I identified with Suzanne Adams' Dangerous Questions, Joe Lloyd Johnson, A Woman's Place. So probably a lot of the female ones, Gretchen Spencer, A Private Journey, It Took a Child, Liz Teo. I think, I mean, I don't know, it's just sort of being able to resonate with other women's experiences in the church. But I think that theme of suppressing questions and having that real kind of that curiosity, that drive, that wanting to understand and wanting to know, but suppressing those questions because of the context, and sometimes as a survival mechanism, and sometimes just because you don't have the space to air them, a safe space to air those questions. I think that was one of the key themes that came through really strongly in some of the women's stories, along with obviously discussions around, a woman's place in the context of Christian faith and the church. Those things really resonated for me.
Yeah, and that's still an issue today as well, which constantly baffles me. I get frustrated when I see social media comments from prominent Christians about the place of woman. I'm married to a wonderful woman who is still a Christian. She occasionally preaches at her own church. And while not this church that she goes to, but previous church, I've been there where people have not gone to services because it's been a woman preaching. And it's crazy. I just find it quite baffling. And when we were both still Christians, I loved being the husband supporting his wife preaching because she preached well. And now that I'm no longer a believer, the last thing I would want to do is to stop her doing that because she gets a thrill out of that. But there are Christians who would not want her to do that.
I have actually. I used to preach sometimes at our church. I mean, I went to I grew up the first 10 years of my life in a fairly fundamentalist conservative church, which is probably less common in Australia than compared to somewhere like the US. And within the denomination that church was part of, they would have been quite an outlier, I think. When I was 11 or 12, my dad became a minister, and we moved churches to a much more liberal leaning church, and which for me growing up was like finding oxygen. Within that context, when I was about 12 or 13, we had a woman who was appointed as like the youth minister, who was amazing, and that in that context it was just very normal for women to be in ministry positions and be up preaching and running things and whatever. And that was I was sort of fostered within that environment. And then I worked in a theological college for a number of years in theology, although I would often in particular contexts people would be like, oh, are you one of the admin people at the college? I'd be like, no, wow. I tutor in theology. And so it was probably a challenge for some people in the class, the fact that, and I was young and I look quite young. I'm older than I look. So to have sort of this kind of little green sprout of a female up there and running their tutorials, I don't know that it was necessarily easy for all of them. But thankfully, the people who were kind of in positions of influence in those contexts were very affirming of me. But I have had, other people in the congregation or whatever say, I'm not coming because I'm not comfortable. You're wow. female and you're preaching. Another woman actually said that to me once. And I was only probably like 18 or 19 at the time. And it's very like, I don't know, cuts deep.
Yeah.
But anyway,
yes,
yeah.
I must be honest, I don't understand where that comes. Well, I do intellectually, in that it comes from a particular reading of Bible verses. But I don't understand it psychologically. I see the value of a woman up there. Look, I'm an IT guy. I have the number of women I've actually worked with, I can still count on the fingers of my two hands.
Yeah, right.
There are so few. But every time it's happened, and I'm really pleased that the team that I'm in now has a woman in it. Every time it happens, the team is better for the presence of a woman.
Yeah.
it just is, full stop.
Yeah. And in the theological college context, the women tended to be very, very proficient in their ability to engage deeply and critically, theologically. Actually, like that is a consistent pattern that I noticed. And maybe maybe I'm biased, but actually the lecturer who I worked with, who was male, was the one who said that to me. The women tend to take this up.
You don't need to convince me. I believe you, just you saying it. I don't doubt it at all. When the best project managers I've worked with have been female.
Interesting.
It's women bring something to the table. Anything that's just men is basically boils down to shit, frankly.
I think that's the quote of the episode, Matthew.
Yes. I ain't cutting that. So, Sarah, there is one name that is missing from the list of contributors, and that's your name. Were you tempted to write your own chapter?
Not until the last 2 weeks, Matthew.
Really? Wow. There's a confession.
Yeah. I have found it really therapeutic reading through and working closely on these stories, because people are articulating things that I haven't been able to articulate myself yet. Mm-hmm. One reason that I haven't written my story, I'm still engaged in certain contexts, with religious studies and theological education, and one of the things that I am really enjoying is not having to define myself by particular stated beliefs.
Okay.
I feel like one of the things that I haven't enjoyed about growing up in the church is the liberty that people feel to so-called speak into your life, right? Or to make judgments about where you're at, or to, and I feel like I have always been trying to say, but I believe this and I believe that, and then look at me doing this. I'm okay. Like, accept that it's enough. And I'm probably trying to convince myself more than anyone. But I've kind of reached a point where I'm like, I just don't feel the need to make a list of my official beliefs and publicize it, or even like have it for my own self, because I think it's actually much more valuable for me to think about my values, and for me to say to people, well, you'll figure out what I believe based on my actions. Like, because we can make stated beliefs, but it's actually the functional beliefs that fuel everything we do that are our real beliefs, and we can't even articulate those a lot of the time. They tend to be very subconscious beliefs. So and it's, writing can be such an important process because it's a matter of bringing those subconscious functional beliefs or operational beliefs into our conscious awareness, so that then we can reflect on them and go, hang on a minute, like, is this healthy? Is this helpful? I mean, this is the point of therapy, right? Like, being able to talk through and think consciously about these things. So if people want to know what I believe, they should look at my life and my values and the things that I write and figure it out. And not having a list of stated beliefs means that my beliefs feel more dynamic. I'm it's like I haven't landed yet. I'm not going to land. We're human. Like, we have values that guide what we do, and they're really, really, really important, and they're important for us to reflect upon. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I get it. And I've seen that some people, when they have these moments of doubts and, questioning Christianity, some people, they say, okay, what I believe or choose to believe or don't believe about this isn't that important. What's important is how I am with people, how I am with the world, and and to use a phrase, to copy a phrase that I've heard before, it'd be Jesus with skin. Just be a good person out there, and what I actually believe is less important than what I actually do.
Yeah.
For people like me who like the sound of their own voice, I want to shout out about what I believe, and I want to criticize you for not believing the right thing. But for some people, that's actually not important. And bless them, that's okay. Not everybody needs to say that. And sometimes sticking your head up and saying that you've taken a stand exposes you to pushback. And quite often people struggle with Christianity to the point where they don't want to attract that kind of gunfire. Yeah. And they would much rather disappear quietly and just be a decent person. Yeah. And that's okay. If that's better for them, that's perfectly okay. I remember the very first time after speaking up about being an atheist, and the pushback, and immediately getting the pushback of, well, you were never a proper Christian in the first place. And I remember knowing that one day it would happen, but being taken aback by how quickly it happened and how firmly it happened. And then, because that took me by surprise by how much it hurt. And then I had it again. And then I had it again. And I was still recovering, and I had it again. And it still is the most common thing I get. And I'm like, guys, do you actually listen to what I'm saying? Have you actually paid attention to what I'm trying to say? And you're still saying, you were never a real Christian. So I get it. If people don't want to expose themselves to that because it hurts, it really hurts, then that's fine. They don't have to expose themselves to it. Just
And I think it's also like a matter of giving myself space to just be in motion, in process, I quite like, so Tim Hatcher, who's contributed to the book, one of his kind of final paragraphs, he says that it feels to him that even calling himself non-religious or atheist or agnostic is still bowing to the societal obligation to label ourselves in relation to religion. And so I kind of feel like, well, I feel like I've had to sort of make it clear that I'm ticking the particular boxes my whole life, and now I'm just going to step back from that list and go, all right, well, how are you going to treat me if you don't actually know? Like, I'm not saying yes this way or yes that way. I'm just stepping back from that list altogether. So that changes the dynamic of how you relate to people. And I think it also sometimes, I guess I want to be able to have relationships with people in all kinds of different contexts. And, because if people kind of see a label, sometimes they just shut off completely. They go, no, I don't, they're not going to listen to someone who's this or who's that. I don't know. I'm always interested in engaging with people in conversation. So I feel like stepping back from that list and going, you can't judge me by that list. But at the same time, that also means that I'm not judging you by that list. And maybe there's a liberty in that when you offer that to someone else and you say, list's not important, I'm just engaging with you as a human being.
There's a gentleness in doing that. I've opted for the spiky way, and I fly the atheist flag, and I'm unashamedly like that. That's not for everybody. And I am glad that there is variety in this community.
Yeah, well, me too. Yeah, absolutely.
So what are you prepared to tell me then? You've dropped a few hints about your own story, Sarah.
Yeah.
You grew up like myself in an evangelical stroke fundamentalist church. What are you prepared to tell the listeners, tell the fellow contributors who will hopefully listen to this about your story?
Well, a lot, actually. I was thinking about it beforehand, and I mentioned in the last 2 weeks that I've been tempted to write my story because thinking back, there's a lot that can be explored without having to necessarily kind of, just like with Tim's story in the book. We got 3 Tims, but with Tim Hatcher's story in the book in particular.
Clearly the coolest name, obviously, isn't it?
Obviously. You don't have to kind of pigeonhole yourself at the end. But, I grew up in a pretty lower to middle class kind of socioeconomic context. I actually grew up in the most multicultural kind of region of Australia, I think. So my grandparents on my mother's side are from Europe, and my dad immigrated from India when he was 19. And my parents met at this evangelical fundamentalist style congregation, which interestingly was actually extraordinarily multicultural. Although in hindsight, now that I think about it, the ministers were always white. I don't like using the word white because it's very blunt, very, very blunt tool, and I don't like it. But you know what I mean when I say they're, but the congregation was very multi-ethnic, and that was a brilliant context to grow up in. But and what that meant was that people really supported each other, it was a very tight-knit community, but it was also very authoritarian. So, and I grew up in that context, and it was sort of reflected in my family context as well. And I was the kind of kid, I was always very quite, sensitive and anxious and relationally attuned, I guess you would say. But I always wanted to ask questions, like from, I was just one of those toddlers who follows their mum around saying, but why, but why, but why? And I've just always been wired that way. And unfortunately, in that context, the answer was, well, because the Bible says so. And that was a very, I guess, quite crushing, I guess, as a child, having that sort of, that part of you shut down. I really took refuge in reading and in books, and I was a real bookworm. And as I mentioned, so my dad went and trained at a Pentecostal kind of theological college. I would like to put scare quotes around the word theological. That might be a bit rude, but that's sort of how I feel about it. And got a job as a minister at a church half an hour away in another sort of lower socioeconomic context. But I actually think that gave a real kind of groundedness to the new church community. So we moved to that church, and he was a minister there. And then after about 3 or 4, maybe 4 or 5 years actually of him being there, he wasn't coping particularly well with being in a position in the ministry position. I think partly because he'd grown, I suppose, as a Christian in a context that was very black and white. And this new church context was much more democratic. It was much more, people questioned those in authority, and accountability was really important. And that was possibly quite threatening. I don't know, or quite challenging for him. But he sort of went into a period of quite a difficult time for him, and he quit that job. But for me, that church community, and the people there, so the youth minister and her husband and some of the youth leaders were just brilliant, loving, accepting people, and it just became my home. And I could not fathom the idea of leaving, even though that my family was moving on. So I continued to go there to youth group and church, and they gave me heaps of opportunities. Just, I mean, in the Christian context, we call them like, mentoring, and I had leadership development opportunities and blah blah. But it was actually putting me in different situations that required me to develop skills like musical skills and public speaking skills and facilitatory skills, facilitating groups and discussion with people, and diplomatic skills and all sorts of things that were really valuable. And I just, youth group on a Friday night was just my world, and the people there. And I met my husband there, so that was a very nurturing environment. But then, I don't know, time went on, and I had kids, and honestly, church started to feel like a bit of a sickening cycle, really, of we get a new minister, and everyone's really excited, and this is God's plan, and then after a few years, things hadn't gone so well, or their family kind of, things hadn't, and then they left. Oh, okay, now we search again. Who does God want us to have? We find someone, and it's all excitement and hope. And then the same thing happens after a couple of years. And it just happened again and again. And my family was part of that cycle. My dad was a minister, and my home life, probably from about age 13 to 14 on, there had already been, you can sort of imagine, sort of the authoritarian style experience, and punishment is what makes us better human beings, apparently, and all those sorts of yucky things. But things got really bad from when I was sort of mid-teens onwards, and I'm the eldest child, so I felt a lot of responsibility, I guess, for looking after my siblings, looking after my mum, And yeah, I think by the time I was like 18 or 19, trying to hold all that together had basically blown me apart. I managed to finish school and do very well, and I think it actually was helpful to have something to focus on. But you know, when crisis hits and life falls apart, you question everything. And I did, in some ways, like, I was still very committed to faith, and then I had my own children, and then as you know, like, having your own children makes you question everything too.
Yeah.
You think intentionally about how do you want to raise your children. Like, you know, I'd imbibed this belief that punishment makes us better, you know, that confessing our sins and focusing on, you know, it's such a weird contradiction in faith, in Christian contexts, where on the one hand, like, we're forgiven and there's grace, but on the other hand, like, we're always pulled back to this reminder that we're sinful, and we need to confess our sins all the time and be right with God. And like, if you're forgiven, just forget it. Like, just face forward and like you say, like, do your best. And I just found that I'd really, as I said, I'd imbibed this, you know, punish yourself to make you better. I really, really wanted to be a good person, like, to be the best I could. But I feel like internally my own, I suppose the climate of my own thinking was shaped by this, this dynamic of we're sinful, you know, this fundamental belief. And maybe that's one fundamental belief that I can state, that I don't think it's actually helpful to label ourselves as fundamentally sinful. I do not think that it is helpful. And that actually is my framework for evaluating the helpfulness of beliefs is, does this belief help people to flourish, or does it diminish them? And I kind of came to this point of, I don't believe in punishing my children. I don't believe that punishment is going to help them in any way. And Christians try to justify it and call it, you know, discipline and blah, blah, blah. It's like rubbish. Like, you're being punitive and you're expecting that to actually help someone to grow. Like, no. And then I thought, well, if I'm not being punitive with my kids, what about with myself? I couldn't, it was sort of like, I suppose it's like when Jesus says, you know, as you do unto others, like, is what you're doing to yourself. You can't have both. You can't live in that contradiction, or I couldn't. So I just had to let go of it. And I thought, well, if I'm letting go of that fundamental belief in my badness and in the belief that I deserve punishment, you know, regardless of whether Jesus has taken that punishment or not, it's like that fundamental belief, like, I can't go on and I can't actually do a good job. Like, I just reached a total crisis point in my life of, I've either got to let some of these beliefs go, or I am not going to be able to be a person who can function effectively, and function effectively to be a responsible parent. It was basically a choice between letting go of certain beliefs and then being able to fulfill my responsibilities as a healthy human with children, or hold on to them and just implode. It really got to that point for me. So yeah, and I'm so grateful to my kids, because I don't know if without my sense of responsibility to them, would I have been able to say no and let things go on my own behalf, like on my own account, just for my own well-being. Like, I don't know.
Do you think you're a different parent than you would have been if you'd remained a Christian?
Oh, 100%.
Sorry, I'm making the assumption that you've fully walked away from Christianity. We haven't actually established
I wouldn't describe. I think there are many shades when it comes to what it means to be connected with Christianity, either culturally or, like, my daughter goes to a Christian school. But that part of that is because I want her to be exposed to those beliefs and those ways of thinking while she's with us and can reflect critically together with us as she's growing, and so that she's not naive, I suppose, as she grows up. But, like, we've got family, like close family, who are still involved at, you know, at church, and and my husband still kind of goes and plays music with his mum at church now and then. So I'm connected with different communities, I suppose, in different ways. But I think if I was still actively part of church life, the way that I would parent my kids would be very different, and the narratives they'd be hearing about themselves and their place in the world, and the sort of meta narrative, cosmic narrative would be very, very different. And it brings me such joy to hear them just ask questions about everything and feel no sense of taboo in saying, I don't think that, I don't agree with that, or our teacher said that, you know, my daughter who goes to the Christian school, my teacher taught us this. I just think that's rubbish. Like, I think it's awesome that she has the freedom to just express herself like that, regardless of you know,
I think that part is a headache, because you've expressed a few things that sound very similar to the way that John Steingard talked when I had him on Still Unbelievable.
Right.
And for those who aren't familiar with the name, John Steingard was a member of the Christian band Hawk Nelson, and he came public about 5 years ago now as having walked away from Christianity and was no longer called himself a Christian. And I had the pleasure of interviewing him with Andrew here on Still Unbelievable, and he said a very similar thing about, he was a young parent, he was questioning things, and this whole concept of looking at God in the Bible and God's action of punishment to those who were, inverted commas, his children, and then how he would, as a human parent, treat his child. And he felt that he felt uncomfortable with the connections there, and that was a feature of his major doubts.
Interesting.
So it's interesting to hear that. And I obviously have low emotional intelligence, because those questions didn't come for me until, you know, I went full intellectual, and all my questioning was intellectual, and I got out of that. And then it was after that, it was like, okay, I've got a 3-year-old child now, I'm no longer a Christian, how do I examine God as parent now? And I went, oh no, you know, what could my child possibly do that I would reject them from my presence? Nothing. No, there is nothing. It was that realization, I went, why didn't I go there?
Well, you know, I mean, we all take different paths, don't we?
We do.
For me, the intellectual path has come sort of alongside that, or after. I mean, look, I did my PhD on a philosopher called Hegel, who's been interpreted in many different ways. But my reading of him has been about the affirmation of thought as part of what it means to be human, because one of the things, as I mentioned, that I struggled with so much was this denigration of critical thinking, this like, stop asking questions, just have faith. Like, I cannot do that. If you have to shut off your critical thinking, then for me that's always a red flag. Like, always, regardless of whether, you know, even I just read a book, a memoir by someone who's not a Christian, not affiliated with faith at all, but who was very much still, you know, we have so much more knowledge from our intuition and our feelings and blah, blah, blah. Sometimes we just have to stop thinking. And I understand what this person was trying to say, but then it's red flag for me. It's like, do not stop thinking, because thinking, it's much more integrated. The process of consciously engaging with life is much more nuanced than dividing between thinking and feeling. And and they're really intertwined, I guess. For me, I suppose. I had somebody literally say to me, stop asking questions and just believe. And I was like, I can't do that. I just can't do that. I've gone too far. I cannot do that. It's just not a possibility. And you, otherwise, I mean, if you try to do that, you've got to shut yourself down. You've just got to go into zombie mode and sign yourself over to something else that is not you, and then that's your life gone.
And as soon as you affirm that kind of mentality, you may as well stop calling yourself an intellectually valid belief system. Because you the only way to be intellectually valid is by challenging, by self-challenge, by exposing yourself to challenge, by welcoming challenge. As soon as you stop doing that, you cease to be intellectually valid.
Well, you stop growing, and it's actually also, it's just a mechanism of control. Like, that's what it is. Stop thinking, just follow, just do it.
Yes, because my question becomes, how do I separate a true belief from a false belief? How do I validate if someone's telling me something? Fact checking is my favorite pastime. I say to people here, I say, fact check me. If I'm doing a review of another podcast, fact checking is what I do.
Yeah. Totally. And it was interesting, like when you were saying, the way we relate to the idea of Christian faith. I guess for me, I'm just philosophically inclined. So I guess you could say I have a philosophical relationship with Christian faith. Like maybe that's how I could describe best where I am at the moment. I have a philosophical relationship with Christian faith. To understand the nuances of that relationship, people might have to read some of the things I've written, because those are the spaces in which I work out what those dynamics are. Yeah.
Excellent. So if I dare ask, what is the title of your PhD?
Oh, do you know what?
It's so simple, it just rolls off your tongue.
What is actually the title? I changed it at the last minute, just like Seth's thesis chapter.
Awesome.
It's called Finitude and Faith. The Hegel something and the
I'm not a philosophical heavyweight by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm familiar with the name Hegel. I don't know anything about him, but I do recall it as a name that comes up in these kinds of discussions, but I won't pretend to be anyway or knowing about philosophy. But I do like hearing philosophers talk. I do like reading a bit about philosophy, but I won't call myself a well-skilled philosopher.
Look, I've got it in front of me now. My thesis title is Thinking, Finitude and Faith, Hegel's Epistemic Reconciliation. And what I'm talking about there, like epistemology, how we know what we know. Yeah. So I'm talking about Hegel's reconciliation here between thinking and the rest of our lives, thinking and feeling, and what that looks like in the context of, Christian belief, and using a word like God. I have written an article where it's sort of like an introduction to German idealism for Christians, and which means obviously it's not for you, Matthew, but you still might enjoy it. But
as long as it's not in German.
No, it's not in German. I did. Yeah, it's not in German. So Hegel was most active in the kind of first 30 years of the 1800s in Germany, obviously, and he was responding to Immanuel Kant and another guy, Fichte and Jacobi, and a lot of their discussions really centered around what can we know about anything, but what can we know about God? And this is kind of why I've gone back there to work through a lot of these questions, because they're kind of trying to explore the fundamental frameworks or the fundamental processes that lie behind and within how we know anything. And I think Hegel's great, and I read he's sort of like this sort of stodgy old German philosopher who, for some reason, that some of his work really resonates with me, and it can be very difficult to read. But the article that I mentioned, I read an article by a Christian leader from Australia who was kind of arguing that mega churches and mega church worship had, in the way that they do things, they sort of have resonances with scriptural traditions and revivalism, and basically that the way they do things is, God ordained, and it's great because this is how God says we should do things, and so look at us, we're doing them. And I had to respond to that, and I did that using some German philosophy, because it's a bit of a lateral kind of way of addressing it without just saying to someone, you can't just say to someone, you're wrong, that's stupid. You actually need a way of engaging intelligently with the issues underlying what they're saying, with resources that, that expand our thinking about it, how we talk about these things. So, I don't know. I'll send you the article link anyway.
and this kind of thinking is good, and I hold my hand up. I'm as guilty of this as the people I criticize, but there is certainly an element of our current atheist/Christian dialogue which skips the thinking and goes straight for boo, you're wrong. And if we can step away from that and actually go back to, okay, you have said that, I'll give what you've said some due credit, and I'll think about it, and here is my thought process, and this is why I think you can be corrected, because here's my thought process. That takes effort, and people have written books on that kind of thing, and maybe there is something we can learn more from that kind of thing. 100 years ago, these kinds of dialogues were had via letter. You would write a long letter, you'd send it, somebody would read it, they'd write a long letter, and 2 weeks later you'd get a reply back. And these conversations would go on for prolonged periods of time, and you'd have lots of downtime for thinking.
Exactly.
With today's internet and 180 characters, there is no downtime for thinking, and there is no capacity for long, thoughtful responses. It simply doesn't exist. And I think that's killed some of the quality dialogue we could have.
That's really interesting, actually, that you say that. Yeah. And I think, like, what's important in dialogue too is to actually, like, ask the question of why is that person making that argument? Like, what are they trying to get at? Because when we talk, when we put things in words, it's hard to actually hit the nail on the head. And often there's like an impetus behind what we're saying that has value to it. But we sort of miss the mark continually, and it's like listening in for that initial impetus. Like when someone says, like in the book that I read, we've got to value feeling and intuition. Well, maybe they've been in a context where those kind of dynamics in our lives have been suppressed or poo-pooed, or maybe like where they've been somewhere where it's like intellectualism is valued, but feelings and intuition aren't. So they're trying to correct the balance. And often it's like we try to correct the balance, but we swing too far in the other direction. And I feel like it can be helpful in these conversations, like what need is this person fulfilling by asserting this statement, by having this belief? Like what is, on a human level, what's happening? What are they trying to say? Yeah, and that, for me, that's a really helpful way of approaching dialogue.
Thank you for that. So this is why I love talking to people who are philosophically skilled, because it helps me to have a better conversation. I love talking to people who are philosophically skilled.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you feel that I'm philosophically skilled, Matthew. I'm not sure about that, but I appreciate it.
Well, I am measuring from a very low bar. Beyond.
No, don't undersell yourself. Don't. It's, I mean, I'm all for philosophy of everyday life. Like, what's the point of philosophy if we can't, if it's not real, grounded in our real stuff?
I mean, I know it's often du jour to lump on philosophy and to scoff on philosophy, but frankly, philosophy gives us the best and most interesting questions, and I think we should acknowledge that. And the best and most interesting questions give us the best and most interesting experience in terms of trying to find the answer.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Let's embrace that. And embrace. Doesn't matter if we find the answer or not. At least we've had a journey trying to do so.
Yeah, so you're certainly not going to learn anything if you don't ask the question in the first place.
Quite. And and that's why I like philosophy, because it does it. It gives us the best and most interesting questions, which always leads to a better life. I had a question on the tip of my tongue, Sarah, but it's suddenly gone. But I wanted to bring us back to the book. Let's try and bring some philosophy in. What do you think? I'm going to put you right on your toes here now. What do you think is the best question then that's asked in the book?
Oh, it's like not even 9 a.m. here in Melbourne yet, Matthew. No, I'm just teasing. What's the best question? Who am I is a pretty good question.
Yep.
That really is underpins a lot of the. Well, I mean, and it's the questions of philosophy. What's true? What is true? What is good? What does it mean to live the good life? A good life. Actually, I think what is true or what is truth is a really big question. One of the really important questions. And I think too, that's kind of something that's fueled a lot of my searching as well. And it was also a crucial pivot moment for me in shifting how I think about things, because in a sort of, I mean, how two-dimensional the idea of truth is in a fundamentalist and sometimes just evangelical context, right? Like, it's true because God says so, it's true because, and we actually have a very dualistic idea of truth, like, and, we might find elements of that in Plato's thinking or in Kant's dualism about things in themselves versus, the phenomena that we experience. But it's sort of like there's this parallel universe of the truth, you know, that that is God's whatever, it's all there, and we have to just kind of try our best to channel that. And when this person says this, that's the truth, because that's God's ordained person, or that's what the Bible says, whatever, you know, and the Bible fell out of the sky as it is, perfect, blah blah blah. No, yeah. I mean, yeah. But I think for me, like, what actually matters is what truth means in relationships. Like, so what I mean by that is, like, what does it mean to be true? Truth as in not the truth, but to be true is actually to be aligned. Like, to be true, like, is, you know, in measurement. Something that is straight and true is, it has integrity. It follows through. And so being someone who is reliable, who has integrity, who lives truthfully, is, I think, one of the significant shifts that our book kind of charts. So people have gone from asking, what is truth? What is the truth? Or I know the truth, actually, rather than what is it? What is the truth is the beginning of the journey beyond that very static notion of truth. Two, how can I live authentically? Like, how can I be truthful in the way that I conduct myself? And what's so ironic is that they've found that those assertions of having the truth are the most inauthentic ways of living for them, you know, for all of our contributors. And what is most authentic is to actually go, hang on, I don't know. Like, that is most truthful. And I think that's one of the fundamentally philosophical themes of our book.
Yes, that sitting with I don't know was probably the big turning point of my deconstruction journey. There was a lot of questioning, there was a lot of crying, there was a lot of pain. But I think one of the biggest single moments of personal progress was when I got to a point where I said, I don't know, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
And when I was able to honestly and with integrity say the second half of that was probably when Matthew became a better person.
Wow. Really interesting. And yeah, there's a poem at the beginning of our book by Liz Teo, who's, I think actually there's 3 contributors from the UK. I think I said 2 earlier, but there are 3, and Liz is one of them. And she's written a great poem which starts our book. And part of that is, you know, she's reflecting on the idea of, well, if you know the answers, why look? But then, you know, but her phrase is, you know, that idea of giving up the blessed assurance and saying, I'm okay with maybe I'm probably wrong, you know? So I think it's great that's surfaced in our book. Yeah.
Yes, brilliant. It is. It's brilliant. I love it. And so getting into the nitty gritty of the book.
Yeah.
Who do you want to read the book?
Oh, good question. Everyone. I actually really want people in the church to read the book.
Okay. Let's see, find out. If you know people in the church, listeners, plug it, please. Plug it. Plug it on your phone. Be brave. Plug it on your Facebook for church people.
Look, obviously, I really, really want people who are in the deconstruction process to read it, because I think it has the potential to offer hope and solidarity and encouragement to people who are, you know, who may be feeling very, very alone. And I know that within that Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group, when people post, I'm really looking forward to us being able to say, hey, we've got this book of stories.
Yeah. Check
it out. It will encourage you. It's okay. Things are going to be okay, because these are stories of people for whom things have been okay. How reassuring it can be when you're in the middle of something and then someone else has been through something similar or has been through something grueling and has come out the other side. That gives us hope that we can do the same. So obviously that is probably my key, the key audience that I hope will read it. But I say that I want people in the church to read it, not because I want to deconvert anyone. Like, that's just not my agenda at all. I want people in the church to read it because I want these stories to be heard in the contexts where the damaging dynamics are perpetuated.
Yes, and that's a very good point.
How can change happen unless people are willing to hear these stories and say, hang on a minute, what have we been doing? Look at the damage we've caused. And that's probably a really tough call. Like, I don't know that, why would people in the church read it? Like, they're probably not going to be interested. But how can there ever be progress beyond these, how can there be reform? How can people recognise the damage that's being done unless they listen? So
yes,
I hope they do.
So I guess you may have answered this question already. Who do you think is going to get the most out of the book?
Well, the contributors and me, probably. Just in terms of, I should say right out that none of the contributors, they've all donated their time and their stories. We're actually donating proceeds from the sale of the print and ebook to a charity that supports people with religious trauma, basically. But I think, I don't know, you're a contributor, Matthew. Do you think you are one of the people who will benefit the most from this book being out there?
Nice way of turning it back on me. I've benefited from the experience in ways that I didn't anticipate.
Okay.
When I jumped on board, I thought, yeah, great, this is another passive way for me to get my story out there, a little bit of selfish self-promotion of the Still Unbelievable brand. Hurrah, hurrah, isn't Matthew great? And then I went through the whole process that I described earlier in the episode to you about the process of not just writing it down cathartically, but then going through an editing process, which I wasn't part of. That had a process separated from me, which was strange but liberating in its own way. And obviously I'm going to go through the whole experience of listening to a third voice reading my story back to me, which I'm looking forward to, but wondering what that's going to bring up for me. So there was definitely a moment of personal growth. But in answer to my own question, I think those who are in the early stages of their deconstruction, whether or not their final destination is in or out is irrelevant, but I think those who are in the early stages of deconstruction are probably going to get the most from it. And reading that book will probably help them to decide, or help them on their journey, whether they go out all the way or whether they stay in a different form of Christianity. I think this book will help those people in that journey. And yes, you mentioned about the proceeds from the book. I should have mentioned that at the head. Yes, all the proceeds are going to a charity. There are practical challenges around how you distribute income from a book like that across 20 different contributors, and that is partly part of the decision. But I am very much on board with the proceeds going to charity. If I want to make money from a book, I literally have to get up early and write my own. Well, this is not a lazy way for putting money into my pocket.
No. And the other thing is that usually, like, if you've got a funder or a publisher who's launching an anthology, they often will pay like a flat fee to each contributor for their rights to their story. We were just ordinary people with an idea, and so and that's sort of how and that's what I mean, like, everyone has contributed so generously to that, to put something into the world that is going to, I think, do a lot of good.
Yes, brilliant. And I hope, I am confident that the book will make an impact. So, obvious question, these stories don't stop. The Graceful Atheist podcast existed for what it did because of stories. If I had the capacity, I would easily be able to fill a weekly episode slot with people wanting to tell their stories. I haven't got it, but I am going to try to bring on board people onto Still Unbelievable to tell their stories. Look out for later in 2025 to see whether or not I've actually managed to achieve that. So the question, if it's not obvious, I'm coming to is, can you see in 2027 Apostate 2?
Very good question. I have sort of been thinking about this the last few weeks as well. I think so, for sure. And I think part of the reason, why I answered that the contributors might be the ones to benefit most from the stories is that, for those who don't necessarily have a public platform, or for those, so some of our contributors have contributed under pseudonyms, so they've remained anonymous.
I did wonder about that, reading through the names. You haven't made it publicly obvious in the Facebook group which ones have and which ones haven't. That's good. I'm very, very cool with that. I don't care. But it is reading through some of the names. I go, yeah, that's a pseudonym.
Yeah, that's right.
Cool to those people. Some people are in places where they're not comfortable with their name being public.
Well, some of the contributors basically they haven't told anyone.
Yeah.
And so this is the first time they've been able to tell their story in a public way, which, is like, I hope is probably like coming up for oxygen for them, just being able to be real. And then being able to have this story, and when they're ready to share it with particular people, say, here's my story. And I think, for those of us who've felt, or for contributors who feel like their voices have been suppressed or not heard or whatever throughout their lives or in the context of faith, this puts their story on a pedestal and says, hey, this is really worth reading. This is a story worth telling. This is a story worth listening to. This is a serious, real story. Like, it's in a book. It's been published. And I hope that gives a real lift to the people who are living those stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to say amen to that, but it kind of felt like it was probably not the right word to use.
Probably preach it, sister, is
Yes. Oh, I'm sure there's a sound effect I can throw in response to that. Sarah, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the past hour and a half with you. It just leaves me with one last question, because I'm sure we could talk for more, but let's give it a break from now. There will be some interviews with some of the contributors to the book, so look out for a future episode of Still Unbelievable where I will be talking to some of my fellow contributors. Maybe I'll have Sarah back on again. Maybe she'll join with some of the contributors. We'll see how it goes. Stay tuned to Still Unbelievable. But Sarah, before I let you go, the usual question I ask all of my guests, or certainly the Christian ones or those who have an interest in Christianity, do you have a favourite Bible character? And impress me, please.
Well, I think it'd have to be the Good Samaritan, right? Yeah. Obviously, he's the protagonist of a parable. So hopefully he ticks the box as a Bible character. But, how can you go past that? Like, someone who breaks down social barriers in order to reach out to someone in need. Like, that's what it's about, right? I could probably more deeply psychoanalyze the Good Samaritan and maybe kind of find some, sometimes in growing up in church, we sort of get trained to give more than what we reasonably have, and we get guilted into, to giving beyond what is perhaps reasonable. And so, but hey, the Good Samaritan was an outsider and surprised everyone. So I like that.
Yes. And he went and he did good for someone else to a level that cost him.
Yeah, absolutely. It cost him. And he like I said, he challenged social expectations and he broke down barriers, and he just related to someone else on a human level, like another human being in need who I can help, and I'll do it. Yeah. If only we could all be a little bit more like that, I think the world would be so much more pleasant to live in. Thank you, Sarah. I've had a variety of answers to that question. You are the first who's done a character from a parable, so brilliant. Good. That's really, I like my little firsts, so that's a great first to have. So thank you, Sarah. Absolutely approve of that one. I didn't call it. Sometimes I think I get a feel for the kind of character it had, but no, I wasn't prepared to go anywhere with you. I didn't know. Who did you think? I didn't. I did wonder if it might be a female, but I wasn't prepared to be more specific than that. Good Samaritan is a good choice. Cool. I like that one. I don't mind the widow who put her 2 pennies in the bowl either. She's pretty. Yeah, I like she's her. A good one. She's good. I'm hoping that one day someone will come up and say the woman at the well. Yeah, I did. She did cross my mind. Yeah, did she really? Oh, brilliant! Excellent. So we'll see.
We'll see if somebody in the future comes up with that one. But yeah, we've had some great answers. Back catalogue if you want to know what all the answers are. I'm not going to list them all here. Maybe that's something I could do, though. List them all, create a list of them. That would be quite cool to do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you again for all the hard work you've done on the book, bringing us all together. I'm really looking forward to the next 2 months while we wait for the proper official launch date, which is a month from today, if my calendar is right.
Yeah.
So that'll be great. The 6th of December today. You're obviously not listening to this on the 6th of December, but yes, so the next month up until launch date, and then the month after that, where we try to plug it across our relative social medias, send it to as many people as we possibly could. I know I'll be reaching out to some podcasts and sending them links to the book and inviting myself on or other people on to talk about the book.
Wonderful.
I will be doing that kind of thing. Listeners, please do that. Social media it to crazy. Let's get this book read by as many people as we possibly can. Thanks again, Sarah. I hope you had a fabulous Christmas and a great New Year. Enjoy the coming spring in Australia. Although it won't be spring for you, will it? It's middle of summer, isn't
becoming autumn.
Yes, yeah. I keep forgetting you guys. That's the one thing I miss, actually. Quick tangent before I hang up on you. Yeah. The one thing I missed from growing up in Zambia was hot Christmases. Because
really? Yeah.
South of the equator, Christmas was always a hot day. We used to take the dining table out into the garden and have Christmas dinner in the garden because that was the time of year. And then here in England, it's wet, it's miserable, it's overcast. You know, the sun sets before you've even finished eating. I mean, there's just no part of the day to enjoy.
Well, you know, it's funny. There are a lot of imported European traditions when it comes to Christmas that don't really fit our context, but that we retain, like the Christmas trees and the hot meals. But sometimes Santa does get around in his shorts and with his stubby of beer and. Excellent. Yes. Fabulous. Cool.
I did enjoy my Christmas in Australia 20 years ago. Right. Thanks again, Sarah. Have a wonderful time and I'll talk to you again soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.
It's been such a privilege, Matthew. Thank you.
It has. Thanks, Sarah. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.